morning started like any other morning in the Galactic Council chamber. Ambassador Velthir of the Karathi Empire sat in his usual seat, reviewing the daily reports on his datapad. The chamber was filling up slowly as various representatives from different species arrived for the scheduled session. The Antaran delegates clicked their way to their seats while the floating Nexians drifted to their positions near the upper galleries. Everything seemed normal and routine, just like it had been for the past 2 decades. Counselor Zix was the first to notice something odd. The insectoid diplomat had worked alongside the human delegation for nearly 15 years and had grown accustomed to their punctuality. The human seats were empty. This was unusual because the humans were always early to every session without fail. Zix clicked his mandibles together in confusion and looked around the chamber, hoping to spot the familiar faces of the human representatives. Somewhere in the crowd, the session was supposed to start in 10 minutes, but there was still no sign of Ambassador Ryan Pierce or any of his staff. Zix leaned toward Velthir and asked where the human delegation might be. Velthir barely looked up from his datapad and waved a scaled hand dismissively. He said the humans were probably dealing with some minor issue and would arrive soon enough. The Karathi ambassador had never been particularly interested in human affairs and saw no reason to worry about their absence. But 10 minutes passed, and then 20, and then an hour. The session began without the human delegation present. High Chancellor Morvan made note of their absence in the official record and moved forward with the agenda. There were trade disputes to settle and resource allocations to approve. The work of the council continued as it always did, whether every seat was filled or not. It was not until the afternoon break that anyone thought to check on the humans more seriously. Velthir sent a message to the human embassy requesting confirmation of their attendance status. The message went unanswered. He sent another one marked as urgent. Still no response. This was becoming more than just unusual. The humans always responded to official council communications within minutes. Counselor Zix decided to visit the human embassy in person. He took a transport across the city to the district where most species maintained their diplomatic facilities. The human embassy was a modest building, compared to some of the grand structures that other species had built. It was simple and functional with clean lines and efficient design. When Zix arrived at the entrance, he found the doors unlocked, but the building completely empty. The reception area where human staff had always greeted visitors was vacant. The desks were clear of personal items. The computers had been wiped clean. Zix walked through the hallways, checking every office and every room. All of them were empty. The walls still had the mounting brackets where artwork had hung, but the art itself was gone. The conference rooms had tables and chairs, but nothing else. It looked like the building had been professionally cleaned and stripped of anything that could identify who had worked there. Zix felt a strange sensation in his thorax. It was something like fear, but mixed with confusion. He returned to the council chamber immediately and reported what he had found. The news caused a stir among the other delegates. Several of them checked their own communication channels to see if they had missed any messages from human contacts. All of them found the same thing: silence. High Chancellor Morvan called an emergency meeting. Representatives from every major species gathered to discuss the situation. No one could understand what had happened. The humans had given no indication that anything was wrong. There had been no disputes or conflicts in recent weeks. The last official communication from Captain Ryan Pierce had been 3 days ago, and it had been nothing more than a routine status update about human shipping routes through Council space. Someone suggested checking the human ships that were supposed to be docked at the orbital stations. A quick scan revealed that every human vessel had departed. The commercial ships, the diplomatic shuttles, the military escorts, all of them had left within the past 72 hours. They had filed proper departure notices and followed all standard procedures, so no one had thought anything of it at the time. The council sent urgent messages to human colony worlds. The messages were received but not answered. They sent requests through every diplomatic channel they had established over the decades. Nothing came back except automated responses confirming that the messages had been delivered. It was as if humanity had decided overnight to sever every connection they had built with the galactic community. Velthir reviewed the security footage from the embassy. It showed human staff members calmly packing up their belongings over the course of several days. They worked efficiently and methodically. They did not appear angry or rushed. They simply looked like people who had made a decision and were following through with it. The last person to leave had been a woman named Commander Lyra Heston. She had done a final walkthrough of the building, then locked the doors behind her and walked away without looking back. The council chamber erupted into debate. Some delegates were angry, claiming that the humans had violated diplomatic protocols. Others were worried about what this meant for trade agreements and defense pacts. A few were simply confused, trying to understand what had motivated such a drastic action. High Chancellor Morven called for calm and said they needed to approach this situation carefully and rationally. But there was no rational explanation that anyone could find. The humans had not been threatened. They had not been insulted, at least not in any official capacity. Their economy had been stable and their colonies were thriving. By all accounts, they had been satisfied members of the galactic community. Yet they had chosen to leave, and they had done so in complete silence. Days turned into weeks and the silence continued. The council sent formal delegations to the borders of human space. Those delegations were met by automated defense systems that politely but firmly turned them away. The borders were closed. Human space was now off limits to all council vessels. No exceptions would be made. The realization slowly settled over the council like a cold fog. The humans were not coming back. They had made their choice, and that choice was final. Whatever relationship had existed between humanity and the Galactic Council was now over. The human seats in the chamber remained empty day after day, serving as a visible reminder of what had been lost, though no one yet understood exactly what that loss would mean. The first real problem appeared 3 weeks after humanity had closed its borders. The Outer Rim territories had always been troubled by pirate activity, but for the past decade the situation had been manageable. Merchants could travel the trade routes with reasonable confidence that they would reach their destination safely. Colonies on the frontier worlds could sleep at night without fear of raids. This security had not come from council patrols or diplomatic negotiations. It had come from a small human task force led by Admiral Kate Morrison. Morrison had operated with minimal fanfare and even less recognition from the council. She commanded 5 ships that constantly moved through the Outer Rim, responding to distress calls and hunting down pirate vessels. Her tactics were aggressive and effective. She did not wait for council approval before taking action. She did not file reports asking for permission to engage hostile forces. She simply did what needed to be done and informed the council afterward. Most council members had barely known she existed. Now the Veklar pirates were testing the boundaries again. The first attack came against a Delian cargo hauler carrying medical supplies to a frontier colony. The ship sent out a distress call and waited for help to arrive. In the past, Morrison's ships would have responded within 15 minutes. This time, the nearest council patrol vessel was 4 hours away. By the time it arrived, there was nothing left but debris and bodies floating in the void. The second attack happened 2 days later, then a third and a fourth. The Veklar were growing bolder with each successful raid. They hit convoys in broad daylight and disappeared into the asteroid fields before anyone could respond. Merchant captains started refusing to travel certain routes. Colonies began demanding protection that the council could not provide. The situation was spiraling out of control. A desperate merchant captain named Corvus sent a message on the emergency channels, asking why Morrison's fleet was not responding to the attacks. He had worked with the human admiral for years and trusted her to keep the trade lanes safe. The silence that followed his question was heavy and uncomfortable. Someone finally explained that the humans were gone, and Morrison had been recalled weeks ago. Corvus could not believe what he was hearing. He asked who was protecting the Outer Rim now. No one had a good answer. The Council Military Committee held emergency meetings to discuss how to fill the gap left by Morrison's departure. They had ships and personnel available, but none of them had Morrison's experience in anti-piracy operations. None of them knew the Outer Rim the way she had known it. None of them had built the intelligence network she had spent years developing. The committee decided to send a standard patrol force to the region and hoped that would be enough. It was not enough. The patrols were too slow and too predictable. The pirates learned their patterns within days and simply avoided them. Attacks continued to increase. Dozens of ships were lost and hundreds of people died. The council kept sending more patrols, but nothing seemed to work. They were trying to solve a problem they did not fully understand because they had never bothered to learn how Morrison had solved it in the first place. While the outer rim burned, another crisis was developing in the core worlds. A disease called crimson fever began spreading through the Delian colonies. It started with a few cases in the outer settlements, but quickly spread to the major population centers. The symptoms were brutal: high fever, internal bleeding, organ failure. The mortality rate was nearly 70% among those infected. The Delian medical authorities had never seen anything like it. They reached out to the Council Medical Research Division for help. The Council's best doctors and scientists examined the disease and ran it through every database they had. Nothing worked. Every treatment they tried either failed completely or only delayed the inevitable. The death toll climbed into the thousands and then the tens of thousands. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. People were fleeing the infected colonies and potentially spreading the fever to other worlds. Someone in the medical division remembered that there had been a human doctor working on similar research. His name was Nathan Cross, and he had been part of the Council's medical exchange program for nearly 8 years. Cross had been a quiet man who spent most of his time in laboratories rather than attending diplomatic functions. Most council members had never met him or knew he existed, but the researchers who had worked with him remembered that he had been studying viral mutations and outbreak scenarios. The medical division sent urgent requests to access Cross's research files. They sent messages to human space asking for any information he might have left behind. The messages went unanswered. The human databases that Cross had used were now locked and inaccessible. Whatever knowledge he had gathered was gone with him. The researchers tried to recreate his work from memory, but it was impossible. Cross had been studying this for years, and they were trying to catch up in days. More people died while the council scrambled for answers. The Delian government issued quarantine orders, but the disease had already spread too far. Other species began closing their borders to Delian travelers. Trade with the Delian worlds ground to a halt. The economic damage was staggering. All because a cure existed somewhere in human space and no one could reach it. A junior researcher found an old file that Cross had submitted to the council 3 years earlier. It was a proposal for establishing disease monitoring protocols and creating stockpiles of broad-spectrum antivirals. Cross had warned that new diseases were emerging from the frontier regions, and that the council needed to be prepared. His proposal had been reviewed by a committee and then filed away. The committee had thanked him for his input and said they would consider his suggestions. They never had. The proposal sat in an archive untouched and unread. While the very scenario Cross had predicted came to pass, Councillor Zix read the proposal and felt something he had rarely experienced in his long life: shame. Cross had given them the answers years ago. He had told them exactly what needed to be done, and they had ignored him. Not because his ideas were bad, but because they had simply not cared enough to pay attention. The humans had tried to help, and the council had treated their efforts as nothing more than background noise. The realization was spreading through the council now. In meeting after meeting, delegates were discovering the same pattern. Humans had been working quietly behind the scenes, solving problems and preventing disasters. They had done this work without recognition or reward. They had simply done it because it needed to be done. And the council had taken all of it for granted. Velthir stood before the assembled council and made a confession. He said they had been fools. They had treated humanity as useful servants rather than valued partners. They had accepted everything the humans offered while giving nothing meaningful in return. Not even basic respect or recognition. The humans had finally decided they deserved better, and Velthir could not blame them for leaving. The chamber fell silent as the weight of their failure settled over them. The galaxy was fracturing and burning because humanity had decided they were no longer willing to hold it together. And the worst part was that the council had no one to blame but themselves. The mining operations in the Helios belt had been running smoothly for years. The belt was rich with rare minerals that dozens of species needed for their technology and infrastructure. Hundreds of workers from different worlds labored in the asteroid mines, extracting valuable ores and shipping them across the galaxy. The work was dangerous, but the safety record had been excellent. There had been very few accidents and even fewer fatalities. The mining consortium had been proud of this achievement and had used it in their recruiting materials. What they had not advertised was that the safety record was almost entirely due to one human engineer named Jake Murphy. Murphy had arrived at the Helios belt 5 years ago as part of a human technical assistance program. He had taken one look at the mining operations and immediately identified dozens of safety hazards. The existing protocols were outdated and inefficient. The equipment was being used in ways it was not designed for. The structural supports in many tunnels were inadequate. Murphy had spent months redesigning the entire operation from the ground up. His new protocols had increased efficiency by 40%, while reducing accidents to almost zero. The workers loved him because his changes made their jobs safer and easier. The consortium executives tolerated him because his improvements made them more profitable. But no one had really appreciated what he was doing. They had simply assumed that any competent engineer could have done the same thing. When Murphy was recalled along with all other humans, the consortium had not worried. They would just hire another engineer and continue as before. The problem started within the first week. The new engineer was competent and experienced, but he did not understand Murphy's system the way Murphy had understood it. Small mistakes began happening. A support beam installed in the wrong position. A safety check skipped because it seemed redundant. A tunnel excavated without proper geological surveys. Each mistake was minor on its own, but they began to add up. The first serious accident happened 3 weeks after Murphy left. A tunnel collapsed during a routine excavation, killing 3 workers and injuring 7 others. The investigation revealed that the tunnel had been dug into an area Murphy had specifically marked as unstable. His notes had warned against mining in that section until additional supports could be installed. The new engineer had not read those notes carefully enough. He had assumed the warnings were overly cautious. The second accident was worse. An equipment malfunction caused the explosion in one of the processing facilities. 17 workers died and the facility was destroyed. The damage cost the consortium millions of credits. The investigation showed that Murphy had recommended replacing that particular piece of equipment 2 years ago. He had identified a design flaw that made it dangerous under certain conditions. The consortium had decided the replacement was too expensive and had chosen to continue using the old equipment. Murphy had implemented safety procedures that minimized the risk, but those procedures required constant vigilance. Without Murphy there to enforce them, the procedures had been gradually abandoned. Production in the Helios belt dropped by 30%. Workers were afraid to go into the tunnels. Some quit and returned to their homeworlds. Others demanded better pay to compensate for the increased danger. The consortium was hemorrhaging money and losing reputation. They tried to bring in more engineers and safety experts, but none of them could recreate what Murphy had built. His system had been elegant and comprehensive, and it required someone who understood both the technical details and the human element of keeping workers safe and motivated. The consortium executives finally went back and read through all of Murphy's reports and recommendations. They found dozens of warnings about potential problems. Murphy had identified instabilities in the asteroid formations that would become dangerous in the next few years. He had suggested new mining sites that would be more productive and safer. He had designed training programs for new workers. All of his suggestions had been filed away and forgotten. The executives had thought Murphy was being overly cautious or even paranoid. Now they realized he had been trying to save lives and they had not listened. Far from the mining operations, another absence was being felt just as keenly. The Council Intelligence Division had always been proud of their ability to detect and prevent threats before they materialized. They had sophisticated monitoring systems and analysts from the most intelligent species in the galaxy. What they had not advertised was that their best analyst had been a human woman named Carla Bennett. Bennett had worked in a small office in the basement of the intelligence headquarters. She was a cryptanalyst who specialized in finding patterns in seemingly random data. Most of her colleagues had considered her work to be useful but not essential. The real intelligence work was done by field agents and senior analysts. Bennett just processed data and occasionally flagged something interesting. At least that was what everyone had thought. The truth was that Bennett had prevented 4 major terrorist attacks in the past 2 years. She had identified the patterns that revealed the attacks were being planned. She had tracked the financial transactions that funded the terrorist cells. She had even identified several key conspirators by analyzing their communication patterns. Each time she had passed her findings to the senior analysts who had taken credit for stopping the threats. Bennett had never complained or demanded recognition. She had simply continued her work. When Bennett was recalled with the other humans, the intelligence division had not worried. They had her systems and her databases. They assumed they could continue her work without her. They were wrong. Bennett's genius had not been in her systems, but in her ability to see connections that no one else could see. She had an intuition for patterns that could not be programmed into a computer or taught to another analyst. The Separatist Coalition had been planning something big. Bennett had been tracking their activities for months and had compiled a detailed report on their operations. She had identified 3 key members of the conspiracy by analyzing seemingly unrelated data from a dozen different sources. She had predicted they would strike at a major civilian target within the next 60 days. Her report had included specific warnings about Proxima Station as a likely target. She had submitted the report to her supervisor, who had thanked her and said he would review it when he had time. The supervisor had never read the report. It had been filed in the system along with thousands of other intelligence documents. When Bennett was recalled, no one had thought to prioritize reviewing her final reports. They had assumed there would be time to go through everything later. There had not been time. The Separatists struck Proxima Station on a busy trading day. The station was crowded with thousands of civilians from dozens of different species. The attack was coordinated and devastating. Bombs exploded in the main concourse, the docking bays, and the residential sections. The station's life support systems were damaged, causing additional casualties. By the time rescue teams arrived, nearly 4,000 people were dead, and twice that many were injured. The Intelligence Division launched an immediate investigation. They went through all recent intelligence reports looking for any warning they might have missed. A junior analyst found Bennett's final report buried in the archives. He read it with growing horror. Bennett had predicted everything. The target, the timing, even 3 of the conspirators by name. The report was dated 6 weeks before the attack. If anyone had read it, thousands of lives could have been saved. High Chancellor Morvan called an emergency meeting when he learned about the report. He stood before the council and read Bennett's warnings aloud. His voice shook with anger and grief. He said they had failed in the most fundamental duty of any government, which was to protect their people. They had the information they needed, and they had ignored it. Not because Bennett was wrong, but because they had not valued her enough to take her seriously. 6 months had passed since humanity closed its borders, and the damage kept spreading like cracks in breaking ice. The council economy had contracted by 18%. Trade routes that had been profitable for decades were now abandoned because no one could guarantee safe passage. Medical facilities across dozens of worlds were overwhelmed with diseases that had once been controlled. Security threats multiplied in every sector as criminal organizations realized the council could no longer respond effectively. The technological sector had stagnated without the steady stream of innovations that human engineers and scientists had provided. In 91ND, a forgotten storage facility deep beneath the council archives, a young clerk named Thissa was cataloging old files. It was boring work that no one else wanted to do, but Thissa was thorough and patient. She worked her way through boxes of data chips and physical documents that had been accumulating for years. Most of it was routine correspondence and bureaucratic paperwork. Then she found a section labeled Human Delegation Reports, and something made her pause. The section was larger than she expected. Thousands of reports filed over 2 decades. Thissa started reading out of curiosity and quickly became absorbed. Report after report showed the same pattern. Humans had identified problems, proposed solutions, and warned about future dangers. Almost all of their proposals had been rejected or simply ignored. Thissa felt a growing sense of unease as she continued reading. She found a report from Professor Helen Grant dated 5 years ago. Grant had been studying the Kepler system and had identified concerning patterns in the star's behavior. She warned that the star was becoming unstable and could produce catastrophic solar storms within the next few years. Grant had proposed establishing monitoring stations and early warning systems around the inhabited planets in the system. Her proposal included detailed cost estimates and implementation timelines. The Council Science Committee had reviewed her proposal and rejected it. The committee note said the costs were too high and the risk was theoretical. They had thanked Grant for her input and moved on to other matters. 3 months after humanity closed its borders, the Kepler system's star had produced exactly the kind of solar storms Grant had predicted. The storms destroyed orbital infrastructure, knocked out planetary power grids, and forced the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people. The economic damage ran into the billions. Grant's monitoring stations could have provided days of warning. The early warning systems could have saved most of the infrastructure, but the stations had never been built because the council had decided they were too expensive. Thissa continued reading and found more examples. Engineer Paul Dixon had designed a new type of shield generator that could protect ships against the advanced weapons the Veklar pirates were developing. Dixon had built a working prototype and tested it extensively. His results showed the shields were 40% more effective than current council military technology. He had submitted his designs to the council military committee along with an offer to help implement the technology across the fleet. The military committee had reviewed Dixon's proposal and declined to adopt it. The committee notes explained that switching to a new shield system would require significant changes to ship designs and supply chains. The existing shields were adequate for current threats. Dixon's new technology was impressive but not necessary. The committee had filed his designs away and continued using the old shield systems. Now council ships were dying because they could not defend against the weapons Dixon had neutralized years ago. The Veklar had upgraded their arsenal, and the old council shields were no longer adequate. Every ship that was lost represented crew members who died because the council had chosen convenience over innovation. Dixon had tried to save them, and the council had decided it was too much trouble to listen. Thissa found a report from diplomat Claire Stevens that was particularly painful to read. Stevens had spent years building relationships with the independent Rim worlds. These were systems that had never joined the council, but had gradually been moving closer through trade and cultural exchange. Stevens had traveled constantly between these worlds, attending their festivals, learning their customs, and showing genuine interest in their cultures. She had built a network of friendships and mutual respect that was slowly bringing the Rim worlds into the council sphere. Her reports showed careful progress over years of patient work. The Rim worlds had started trading more with council members. They had begun cooperating on security matters. Several of them had expressed interest in eventually applying for council membership. Stevens had nurtured these relationships with skill and dedication. She had never asked for recognition or special privileges. She had simply done the work because she believed it was important. When Stevens was recalled, the entire structure had collapsed within weeks. The Rim worlds felt abandoned. They had trusted Stevens personally, and her absence sent a clear message that the council did not value them the same way she had. Trade agreements were canceled. Security cooperation ended. Several Rim worlds that had been moving toward council membership announced they would pursue independent paths instead. Years of careful diplomatic work had been destroyed because the council had not understood what Stevens was building until it was gone. Thissa compiled all the data she was finding into a comprehensive report. The statistics were damning. 73% of human proposals had been rejected or ignored. Of the proposals that were eventually implemented, 91% came after a crisis that the humans had predicted. The average time between a human warning and council action was 17 months. In most cases, the delay had cost lives or caused enormous economic damage. The pattern was clear and shameful. Humans had tried to help. They had offered solutions and warnings and innovations. The council had systematically dismissed their contributions, not because the humans were wrong, but because the council had never truly respected them. The humans had been treated as useful servants, rather than valued partners. Their work had been accepted when convenient and ignored when it required effort or change. Thissa's report included specific examples that made the failure impossible to deny. Grant's warning about the Kepler system had been ignored and thousands had suffered. Dixon's shield technology had been rejected and now crews were dying. Bennett's intelligence about the terrorist attack had been filed away, and 4,000 civilians had been killed. Murphy's safety warnings had been dismissed and miners were dead. Stevens' diplomatic work had been abandoned and entire regions were now hostile to the council. Every human who had served had faced the same treatment. Their expertise had been utilized but never truly valued. Their warnings had been acknowledged but rarely heeded. Their innovations had been examined but seldom adopted. They had given years of their lives trying to make the galaxy better, and the council had responded with polite indifference. Thissa submitted her report to High Chancellor Morvan with trembling hands. She did not know if anyone would care about the findings of a junior clerk, but she felt compelled to document what she had found. The report was delivered late in the evening. Morvan read it through the night. By morning, his 4 eyes were dim with exhaustion and something that looked like grief. He called an emergency session of the full council. Every delegate was required to attend. Morven stood before them and presented This's findings without commentary. He simply read the statistics and shared the examples. He let the facts speak for themselves. The chamber fell silent as the full scope of their failure became undeniable. They had not lost humanity because of a single insult or conflict. They had lost humanity because of 1,000 small acts of disrespect spread across 20 years. Every ignored warning, every rejected proposal, every dismissive response had added weight to the burden until humanity had decided they deserved better. And they had been right to leave. 1 year had passed since the day humanity closed its borders and disappeared from galactic affairs. The Galactic Council chamber felt different now. The space seemed larger and emptier, despite having the same number of seats as before. The human section remained vacant, and somehow those empty seats drew the eye more than any occupied ones. They had become a silent monument to failure that no one could ignore or forget. High Chancellor Morven stood at the central podium addressing the full assembly. Every delegate who could attend was present. This was not a regular session but a formal acknowledgement of what had happened and what had been lost. Morven looked older than he had a year ago. The weight of leadership during this crisis had aged him in visible ways. His 4 eyes moved slowly across the chamber, taking in the faces of those who had governed the galaxy alongside him. He began speaking in a voice that carried both authority and sorrow. He said they had spent the past year trying to understand why humanity had left them. The Council had sent diplomatic delegations to the borders of human space. Every delegation had been turned away politely but with absolute firmness. The human border patrols had been courteous and professional. They had simply made it clear that the borders were closed and would remain closed. No exceptions would be granted. The Council had sent countless messages through every communication channel they had established over the decades. Most went unanswered. A few received automated responses confirming delivery, but nothing more. It was clear that humans were receiving the messages. They simply chose not to respond. The silence was more painful than any angry rejection could have been. Morvan paused and looked down at his notes. He said the Council had sent official apologies. They had sent offers of renewed partnership with better terms and more respect. They had sent pleas for dialogue and negotiation. They had offered trade concessions and favorable agreements. They had promised to listen better and do better. Every message had gone unanswered except for one. The response had come 6 months after humanity's departure. It was a brief message from someone named Director Linda Hayes, who apparently spoke for Earth's diplomatic corps. Morven activated the display and the message appeared on every screen in the chamber. The words were simple and professional. Hayes thanked the Council for years of cooperation. She stated that humanity had decided to pursue an independent path forward. She wished the Council well in future endeavors. She requested that no further contact attempts be made. That was all. There was no anger in the message. No accusations or demands. No explanation beyond the simple statement that humanity had chosen independence. The tone was the same one might use when declining a dinner invitation or resigning from a job. Polite, final, and completely impersonal. Councillor Zix spoke up from his seat. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the chamber. He said the lack of anger was what haunted him most. If humanity had been angry, the Council could have negotiated. They could have apologized and made amends. They could have worked to rebuild trust. But humanity was not angry. They were simply done. They had decided the relationship was not worth maintaining and had moved on. There was nothing to negotiate because humanity had no interest in negotiation. Veltir stood next. His scales had lost their usual shimmer and his movements seemed heavy. He said he had been reviewing his own records from the years of working alongside human delegates. What he found had filled him with shame. In 7 years of regular interaction with Ambassador Claire Stevens, he had never once invited her to a cultural exchange. He had never asked about human customs or traditions. He had never treated her as anything more than a functionary who attended meetings and filed reports. Stevens had helped negotiate the Corward Treaty, which had prevented a war between 3 council species. Her diplomatic skills and patient mediation had saved countless lives. When the treaty was finalized, Veltir had not even attended the celebration. He had sent a junior aide with a formal congratulations. Stevens had spent months bringing hostile parties to agreement, and Veltir could not spare an evening to acknowledge her achievement. He had simply assumed she was doing her job and nothing more. Other delegates began sharing similar realizations. Each one had memories of working with humans who had contributed greatly while receiving minimal recognition. The stories painted a clear picture of how humanity had been treated. Their presence had been accepted. Their work had been utilized. But they had never been truly valued as equals or partners. High Chancellor Morven said they had reduced humans to their utility. The Council had taken what humans offered and never thought about what was owed in return. Not payment or rewards, but something more fundamental. Respect, recognition. Genuine place at the table as equals rather than useful. Subordinates who should be grateful for being included. Someone from the back of the chamber asked the question everyone was thinking. Was there any way to convince humanity to return? Could the Council make amends and rebuild what had been lost? Morven shook his head slowly. Director Hayes had been clear in her message. The decision was final. But even if the Council could somehow convince humanity to reconsider, what right did they have to ask? The humans had been among them for 20 years. 20 years of steady service and contribution. 20 years of warnings and solutions and innovations. 20 years of being tolerated but never truly appreciated. The Council had squandered that gift through arrogance and blindness. They had taken for granted something precious, and now it was gone. Asking humanity to return would be asking them to accept the same treatment all over again. No one who had any dignity would accept that. The chamber fell into a long silence. The truth was settling over them like heavy snow. They had failed in ways that could not be repaired. The galaxy would continue and the Council would adapt. They would learn to function without humanity's steady hands guiding and protecting and innovating. But the cost of that adaptation was being paid in lives and suffering across dozens of worlds. The empty human seats would remain empty. Morven announced that the Council had voted to leave them vacant permanently. They would stand as a reminder of what had been lost and why. Future generations of Council delegates would enter this chamber and see those empty seats. They would ask why humanity was not present, and they would be told the truth about how arrogance and indifference had driven away the species that had given so much while asking for so little. Somewhere beyond the borders of Council space, humanity was building something new. They were creating their own future, free from the burden of serving those who did not value them. Reports from long-range sensors suggested that human space was thriving. Their economy was growing. Their technology continued advancing. They were doing perfectly well without the Council. Better perhaps than they had done while trying to help species who had never appreciated their efforts. The Council would survive this loss. Systems would adapt and new solutions would eventually be found for the problems humanity had been solving, but nothing would ever quite fill the void that had been left. The humans had not just provided skills and knowledge. They had provided something harder to quantify. A steady reliability, a willingness to do what needed to be done even when it was difficult or thankless, a quiet dedication to making things better.